You're not having the after lunch slump, but are more energized and excited for the last session for today. So this session is going to be moderated by our very own Jafar Beg, also co-organizer for this event. Jafar works at Final Mile as a behavioral architect, and like Junafi mentioned, he did his master's in behavioral economics from the UK a couple of years ago. I met Jafar on Facebook a year ago, and we started doing some events in Mumbai, super informal ones, nothing like this, over beer, basically, just to talk about behavioral science and and the applications it would have in India. And so this has grown out of a passion from all of us, and I won't waste much time. So I'm gonna introduce Jafar and ask him to take over and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Panki, for the introduction. Awesome. Great. Are we missing someone? Aditya. Yeah. Well, thank you, Pankti, for the kind introduction. So, hope you guys all had nice lunch. So we're at 3:05, and we're planning to wrap up at 4:30. So we'll trying to keep this very informal, right? Like a fireside chat kind of format. So we'll go on till say 4:45, 4:05, and then have like a 20-25 minutes of Q&A. Yeah. So let me introduce the panel to you. Anurag, everyone's already met and seen him talking, but I'll anyway go ahead and introduce him again. He's a co-founder of Final Mile Consulting, and Final Mile has been around in 2008, and he's been driving a lot of robust research in methods and strategies and technology methods for research in behavioral sciences. And we've done projects in Africa, Europe, US, and India, in development sector and private sector. Right? That's Anurag. Sana is a behavioral scientist at Dalberg Design. She has a doctorate in social psychology from Cambridge University, and she's tried to merge both worlds, industry and academia, and she advises both public and private sector clients as part of Dalberg. Next, going to Sally Ann. Thank you, Sally Ann, for coming all the way down for us. Sally Ann is founder of GLEG, and she has doctorates and degrees in law and urban planning and political science from Harvard University. So her work mostly focuses on human skills in the digital platforms, looking at skill development and people development, designing learning platforms that drive engagement. Aditya. Aditya is a social entrepreneur with a background in design and social sciences. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he has 2 doctorates from University of Chicago. Aditya has built several organizations, and one of the main ones is the Vihara Innovation Campus, which is basically the part of the Center of Knowledge Societies. Also, Dr. Aditya also led the Behavioral Innovation Lab that you'll also hear about a lot, along with Gates Foundation, right? And Preeti Anand is a project manager with Ideas 42. She's worked on a diverse set of projects on design and test solutions that apply behavioral sciences in financial services, health, wash sectors across Asia and Africa. And last is Yogita Kaul. Yogita Kaul has more than 18 years of experience in industry. She's led complex policy implementation program changes, and she has a master's in behavioral sciences from LSE and an MBA from the university. She has led a behavioral science consultancy before this, and now she is the founder, and she's running the Nudge In Foundation. Right? Okay, cool. So, I mean, this question is vague, but we sent it out to everyone. I'm sure everyone has had a look at it, right? So we spoke a lot about policy, application of behavioral science in policy sector, but not a lot gets spoken about application of behavioral sciences in industry, right? So we want to quickly hear from each one of you. What are the best or the most impactful behavioral science project or intervention that is most memorable to you, and you think if it gets replicated in India or already has been, would be of great impact? So, a quick 2-3 minutes round of, you know, we can start with anyone, maybe Anurag.
Happy to talk. Yeah, I think the private sector is very very imaginative about what they can do with behavioral sciences, and also kind of they are the first to kind of take any opportunity that comes their way, right? So we've done a lot of work, and specifically to your question, I think different sectors offer different kind of leverage, right? My experience with development sector has been that it's very very research oriented, so you kind of do deep research and then create broad design programs which are toolkits of nature, and then kind of let a group of people kind of implement such solutions. That's been our experience. In financial services, on the other hand, the testing environment is beautiful, right? So I mean, if you can kind of collate data science and behavioral science and then create solutions that can be quickly A/B tested over like 15 days, not even months, right? You get extremely efficient outcomes from those kind of programs. The results are very measurable, right? Iteration is much faster. And so simply from the point of view of effectiveness of a process and outcome of a project, financial services probably offers the one of the best kind of environments to work in. Health again has been fairly good, but factors like adherence in TB, for instance, has been a challenge in terms of how to implement, right? But at the same time, when you're working with the private sector in Europe and doing work on Parkinson's, it doesn't take much to implement and test, right? So I would say that's the nature of the business we are in, right? I mean, at the last mile, there's a lot of challenge and of different kinds in different industries.
Hi, so as Ideas 42, we work in the social development space, but most of our projects we work with private organizations. And we have worked with a lot of private profit-making financial services companies. So yeah, as Anurag said, financial services offer you a lot of opportunities to do digital data testing. It's very open to more innovative kind of solutions. So, but our experience has been a mixed bag. Some things worked very well. We worked with fintechs, we worked with MFIs, with small finance banks. So what has worked well in some instance, like some of the fintechs who have been very adaptive to this approach, and they have taken up not just the projects but also done a lot of capacity building amongst themselves and trying to integrate it in
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So what I can say is one of the projects that we did, our first project was reducing the use of disposable cups, and we so instead of looking at just how do we reduce the use of disposable cups in an instance, we try to look at what are the other environmental issues that are happening with the consumer. And one of the biggest things that came back, of course, is the use of plastic. But a lot of incentives was used over there. So our position of doing the project was to not use incentives. In the case that we did see movement and reduction in reduction in the use of disposable cups. But I think this is one of the opportunities. So I'm not trying to tell you what we did and what we not, but this is one of the opportunities where even the private sector has a lot of social responsibility, which is a outcome or a byproduct of the sales of whatever they are doing, Tetra packs, these kind of things. So I think one of that is an opportunity. In terms of your question, in terms of what works, what is happening, I can add that I feel that in the Indian market, while there is a lot of excitement about behavioral science in the private sector, the moment you say behavioral science, everyone is excited. But the moment you say A/B testing or RCT testing, they take a step back. Because for multiple reasons, one, we don't know how this is done, we have never done this before, our employees, our people are going through a lot, our management will not approve, a lot of those things. So I think somewhere that buy-in for RCTs in the private sector is required. And the example I always use is you pop a paracetamol every day, or almost every day. But in the current environment, we do every day. And that paracetamol, to get to that paracetamol, there were several RCTs and tests done. So if a product that is being used by you every day took a lot of time, any intervention that you want to implement for a longer run needs to have at least some time, give us at least 3 weeks. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we have to find different arguments to make.
So you are a culprit, is it? You've been saying 3 weeks, huh?
Exactly. So I think as we've talked a little bit about financial inclusion, I'm also going to talk about financial inclusion. But before we do, I'll just tell you a little bit about Dalvik Design, who I've been working with for the last couple of years. So Dalvik Design sits within Dalvik Advisors, which is a social impact consultancy. And Dalvik Design uses human-centered design research across strategy, across design for projects in financial inclusion, health, agriculture. And one of the reasons that I started advising Dalvik Design is because we wanted to see whether we could bring together more of an integrated methodology. And I think today we've talked a lot about behavioral economics and behavioral science as a very pure science. But we've done a lot of work around can we overlay behavioral science with a human-centered design process? And what does that look like? And how can we play off the strengths of each? So for example, with human-centered design research, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but it's more of a participatory kind of research design. It puts the user at the center, and it uses a number of kind of qualitative research tools. It's very helpful to actually immerse oneself in the ecosystem in which all the biases that we talk about in behavioral science actually operate. It's also helpful to behavioral science because it can also inspire at new, creative, more generative ways of addressing kind of the complex social problems that we face. And I think it also results in more agile, lightweight solutions compared to what behavioral science kind of can sometimes produce. On the other side, behavioral science adds robustness to the human-centered design process. Human-centered design process is often kind of based on intuition and assumptions, and it adds rigor, robustness, and measurability. So that's the kind of work that we've been doing. One of the projects, and the reason I bring it up is because we've got Basari here and Ashoka here as well. So we conducted a project about a year and a half ago in financial inclusion, and the main aim of this was to inspire financial service providers to no longer segment low-income consumers just by demographics, because that's what was happening kind of before, and actually look a little bit more at consumers' behaviors and their psychological profile. So how do low-income consumers plan and prioritize? How do they build reserves? How do they cultivate receivables? And from a psychological conscientiousness play in how one manages one's finances. So together with Busara and Ashoka, we came up with a kind of three-dimensional framework of your demographics, behavior, and psychographics, developed a survey tool which we rolled out in 7 countries, and at the same time combined that with human-centered design research. And that was a really important integration, and so one of the things that I always talk about is the need for a multidisciplinary approach, because you need to have that initial kind of human-centered design approach to understand the context. We've talked so much about context today and the nuances and the norms that vary across, not just states but communities. And so human-centered design is really useful to do that. But then you also need the rigor that came with this survey that we rolled out. And as a result of this project, we had kind of segments, these kind of more multifaceted segments across India. And we then worked with financial service providers to actually design and kind of prototype segment-specific products and financial services. So for example, if we have a segment which is kind of middle-aged women who want to start a small business, and they're very high in conscientiousness, what kind of product can we develop for them? Okay, let's develop some kind of home business starter kit that leverages their natural kind of proclivity to entrepreneurial behaviors and their conscientiousness. And then what we did is brought those financial service providers early on into the co-design process, which Nate talked about before, and prototyped and tested it with them. And I think that was a really, it didn't work with all the service providers that we worked with, but even if you have one who takes that on, it can be really powerful. So I think that has been one project that's been very impactful.
Hi, I'm Salian. I'm going to talk a little bit about everything I've heard today and how it impacts in terms of private sector and how it would roll out, and be mobilized in India. So one of the things I noticed, and I come from both sides. I have a foundation and I also have a technology company. For private sector to actually adopt everything we talked about today, we really need to talk about dollars, conversion, measurability, and nobody seemed to talk about that today. And this is where policymakers kind of sit on one side and business sits on the other side, and you're not having the same conversation. It's like speaking French and Arabic. So let's talk about specific behavioral policies that have been implemented. So let's look at something like opting out for organ donation. So that would be an example of certain countries. I don't know if many of you, I'm sure everyone I've spoken to is so brilliant in this room. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that study about the simple difference of having a box where you opt in versus opt out for organ donation. If you have to opt out, most of us never really opt out, and organ donation skyrockets, right? So countries that have the highest, let's look at that from a policy standpoint of social impact, countries. How does that play out in business? That would be something that's a business can put their hands around. You can measure it. You can actually implement it. Let's look at something like choice architecture, right? Or let's look at something like loss aversion. If we really, and look at how it's applied in terms of policy, in terms of NGOs, governments, addressing social impact issues, and then specifically translate that to industry where it can be implemented, it can be measured, and again, if it's not touching a balance sheet or a P&L or a conversion, well, no one's going to have the conversation. It's just warm and fuzzy. So, that's one of the things I wanted to mention. Another thing I wanted to mention was, and it was in a conversation, and the lovely thing about being here is that the brain trust in the room as a collective were so much better than just the 5 or 6 of us sitting up here on the panel. So just speaking with everyone outside, I was having a conversation where all of this actually existed in marketing for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, marketing has changed, and now it's a lot of educators and policymakers talking about behavioral science. But if we actually just look back, the majority of what we're talking about and we're implementing has been there and has been in use and being manipulated by the marketing industry for decades. Just go back and read the original Saatchi books or any of the great advertising companies out there. It's just that marketing is in this shift right now, and now our voices, those of us in the behavioral space, whether we call ourselves organizational, behavior architects or whatever it is we call ourselves, our voices are the ones right now. But so this is kind of in terms of the, just to close by answering your question, everything we're talking about will not really be specifically applied in terms of industry and business if there is not a tangible measure, because that's how business functions.
That's a part of a challenge, and even if it's measurable, what is the incentive to share those results, right? We'll come to that in a bit, yes. Aditya, you want to take?
Yeah, thanks. And it's really been a great pleasure to be here this morning. I was totally unprepared for what I'd said yes to. Since nobody else has answered your question, Jaffer, I'm going to use the opportunity to share a bit about what we've been doing for the past decade. And it occurred to me that just about a decade ago, we convened an event called Design Public. We said design and innovation should be used for the public good, and governments should make use of this. And this was in, I think, Taj Vivanta down the road. And we had a tough time getting anybody from the government to actually come at first. But we did get people from MindLab in Denmark and the NHS in the UK, and I think people from the Milan Politecnico to come in and share some case studies. And for a really long time, I felt like, we were way too early and we were whistling in the wilderness and nobody was particularly interested in this way of doing things. That particular convening in 2009 resulted in something called the Bihar Innovation Lab, around which there's a case study in this little booklet. At the time that we did the Bihar Innovation Lab, we were naively convinced that ethnography and design would reveal some outstanding ways of doing things, which would then just massively, be received with applause and go to scale and change the world. Our getting stuck in with the Bihar Innovation Lab helped us realize that the toolkit we had was quite inadequate, and there's a range of other ways of doing things that we would need to kind of acquire in order to be more successful. The Bihar Innovation Lab was focused on public health, in particular on vaccine delivery services. Out of that came a number of interactional intervention strategies, micro designs, new scripts for how to interact with people, new ways to organize space, but also something called the Vaccine Delivery Kit, or A&M workstation. And because that didn't immediately go to scale in that state, we were somewhat, disoriented and disappointed. And it then took like a couple of years, and then now we have multiple conversations in different states of India where there are different ways of getting these things piloted in aspirational districts and in some cases at a statewide level. But that kind of conversation, that kind of deal making is a wholly different kind of skill as related to actually coming up with the idea or having the empirical ethnographic insight or having kind of maybe the design boldness to say this is what's actually needed. I want to pivot slightly to talk about public policy versus public services. Because if I'm not wrong, for the most of the day, we've talked about public policy. And when you're talking about something like the price of Durex condoms, or when you're talking about whether something should be incented or not, or what the design of a PHC should be like, it's unfortunate that that's considered policy. It really has a lot to do with how a product or service is rendered, in this case by an agency that happens to be controlled by the government, or in fact be the government itself. So is that really policy? And if it is really better described as public service, then there's really a shockload of designing of public services that's going to be required. Thank you, Sana, for your many comments, and I'm sure we already agree on most things in the world. The other thing I want to say before I shut up is something about, the the fracture and splintering of different ways of knowing the world. So it's a damn shame that in the Anglo-American Academy you have, psychology and human development, you have sociology, anthropology, economics, behavioral economics, classical economics, and these ways of knowing the world, basically you could do 5 years or 11 years of grad school and never really need to confront questions that you will certainly need to confront when you deal with the real world. So contrary to my academic training, in the real world, in the last 15 years that I've been working, it is often the case that you need to answer why a psychographic metric may or may not be predictive of kind of the variable or the issue that you're addressing. And so if we could, address that in some way in our further discussions, that would be cool. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Aditya, for that. So just picking up from what Anurag and Preeti mentioned, right? We've all been talking about policy implications of financial inclusion, behavioral interventions, right? From the government's perspective. But a big gap is the industry part, right? How do we get the buy-in of industry in it? Because ultimately the products that are being sold in the market are by private organizations and banks, which have profit motives, right? So along with trying to apply behavioral sciences from the policy perspective, what are the challenges that we have seen, or are the biggest challenges that are, still at large that needs to be solved? Anyone?
So while we are kind of startup, I've been sort of observing the market as a new entrant, and I've met a lot of social sector players. I've met people in the government. I've spent time with some existing behavioral science consulting firms outside of India. I used to do something in the Australia until recently. I feel that the big difference between the private sector and the social sector and even the government is this availability of data. Oh, sorry. Someone told me I'm not audible. Availability of data. I think when an intervention happens, let's say by an Ideas 42 or BIT, it's published and it's available and we know what they're doing. I think the industry pretty much learns on their own whatever good interventions are. I spoke to a lot of developers, product designers and developers to understand how they go about, and with some really prominent companies. This does not include Uber and the ones that we already know are doing product design, but companies that are Indian organizations who are using, you can see when you use their apps, they're using some kind of behavioral science. At least that's what you feel. And when I spoke to them, I said, so how did you design this? Do you use behavioral science? Do you have a behavioral science team within you? None of them have a behavioral science team within themselves, but a lot of their products are pretty much on the global principles. And I felt that is a natural process of their learning, because they're using a Facebook, an Uber, say whatever app, Grab app or whatever app they are using, and that they're learning through that. So I think the industry spends learning themselves. Like Anurag said, that in India we are just used to get on the job and you learn it. That's one area where I feel that the industry hasn't seen the value of bringing in research, the rigor of research within their decision making. That's one of the biggest challenges. That's what I would say, I think.
Okay. You asked about the challenges in the industry, right? Okay. So where do I start would be the right thing, but to prioritize, it goes without saying that any profit-making company, business needs to have a buy-in. They need to believe in when they are engaging you, okay? So even if they are not paying you directly, if it's a funded project, they still need to spend time, resources, and give you access to their platforms, their customers, which is a risk, and it involves investment from their side. So that's like the basic. I wouldn't go much deeper into it. The most critical issue we face is the time they have. because they are, especially we're working with digital financial services today, they are changing by the day. So they want some solutions fast. I mean, as Ideas 42, we work with, we trying to understand the problem much deeper, then diagnosing it, and then getting into design, and also getting into a rigorous testing. So if we start with the problem identification and the diagnosis, that's still something, you get the businesses buy-in on, because they're used to working with, let's say, management consultants, Big Four. They understand you'll come, you'll study, you'll try to diagnose the problem. Many times they actually get excited because, as behavioral designers, we come up with some really good insights. They haven't seen those sides of customer behaviors. So that excites them. Then we get to design, and I mean, of course, this is still, we'll say it's on a faster mode of working than we would ideally like to work. And when you get to design, you try to do a collaborative design. We would like to come up with innovative, out-of-box designs, but then you sit together, you do a collaborative design, you shortlist, you see what's feasible, what is likely to have impact. That's also something, they are open to, they work with you on that. Now that's where their patience now starts running out, is because they like some design, they say, okay, let's go out, let's roll it out. Let's roll out to the entire state, entire country. Because if we are investing in testing, this A/B testing or something, we are anyways doing all the changes. Why wait? Let's anyways roll out. So that is a challenge which we saw, that the testing appetite is not yet there, and they see you, they have been used to seeing management consultants, or they expect you know behavior science, come up with solutions, give us what will work. So to explain it to them that we don't have a magic bullet, we would like to come up with a bucket of solutions, test some permutations, combinations, do iterations, get into a very structured testing methodology, which will help you in the long run, is the most challenging part we have been facing. And that's I would say for the organizations which are digital to a large extent. Now, most of the organizations we have worked with, who work with, let's say, lower income populations, have digital to an extent, but the last mile is assisted. And that just complicates the implementation to another level. Because now, at the last mile, you have a human interface. And he's the one who's going to be delivering your intervention. So however good app interface you design, however good charts you design, games you design, if the person delivering it doesn't believe in it, he would still go and ask them, do you want to open a fixed deposit? How much should I open, 20 or 50? So he's not really going to go through the entire protocols. Your design has gone for a toss. So that needs a lot of hand-holding, and then it becomes a more laborious process. So we believe they are digital financial services, but the last mile connectivity really complicates things.
Just to add to both those points, I think that really neatly summarizes it. I think a lot of time is spent managing client expectations because, and we've talked about this today, because the association of behavioral science is nudge, these quick wins. That is what is often expected, very low risk, high impact, measurable change. And so a lot of time is just spent in educating and informing. Another one, I think, just to add to that, and it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap with the previous panels, but I think is the need, often what I see is that there's just kind of one champion or a couple of champions of let's apply behavioral science here, and there's a need to bring on more. And you have to do a lot, again, the same kind of education, just to have more champions within a firm, within a company that you bring along when you implement a solution.
Yeah, Rag, you want to respond to that?
No, so I just wanted to go back to the specific reference you made to the financial inclusion program, and how do you get banks to kind of participate in the implementation of the solutions, right? I think project to project things differ, and financial inclusion is fairly complex, right? I mean, the government objectives are not the same as private banks and public banks' objectives, right? I mean, financial inclusion is not a profitability game, so to begin with, right? And so, one of the things possibly, and we did the financial inclusion work as well, and it's it's very distressing that despite all the work and all the money that Gates Foundation has spent and everything else, um, we can take solace in the fact that we learned a lot and industry learned a lot, but from a solution perspective, right, none of it got implemented, at least thus far, and primarily because I think the banks were not cooperating to the process right up front. Right, so right up front it was a research project, and then it became a design project, and so on and so forth. And once you have kind of figured the design, you're now asking the banks to and implement, and a public sector bank will find 100 reasons why they won't do something now and then later and then never, right? So that's been one of the challenges, but also to allude to the fact, I think in one of the earlier presentations I saw a slide which said make it easy, and there are three more things, right? I agree, make it easy for the consumer, but does not necessarily mean make it easy for the manufacturer as well, right? So sometimes we kind of dial back to communication as our go-to for every solution every behavior we want to change, right? But if financial inclusion requires new products which are appropriate for that population, rather than sell them products that I'm kind of using, then even if it takes time, right, go build those products, right? And rather than saying, we can get the BC, the bank correspondent to kind of somehow represent themselves differently, or kind of get people to think, the government will put 5,000 rupees in a bank and then suddenly are included in accessing the accounts. I think a lot of complexity in those kind of projects, and typically you don't see those complexity when, say, a Unilever or a bank kind of really starts a project in their own system and then implement it. I haven't seen those kind of challenges in the private sector, unless it's kind of coming from somewhere else and then kind of pushed onto them. Does that make sense?
I just wanted to mention about two financial inclusion projects that my foundation was involved in, and how we used a lot of behavioral nudges to really involved private banking sector and the central bank of a particular country, and how it actually worked to shift banking in this country. So originally I'm from an island called Trinidad and Tobago, for anyone who watches cricket, West Indies. And one of the things we looked at in terms of financial inclusion, and we were looking at a couple of issues, not only inclusion, we were looking at literacy, and we were looking at the farming sector. And it was really a simple experiment we ran, and we just looked at behavior and looked at when would people like to bank. And the answer came to, in terms of everything that we did in terms of behavior in that country, was on the weekends, and banks were closed. So what we did is with the private banking sector, so we tapped into their branding and marketing, because for them that actually meant something for them, is we converted buses in that country to mobile banking centers that would go out into the communities on weekends, to the most remote communities. And the uptake in terms of opening up new accounts, and those banking centers, they would roll out and they would actually give financial literacy classes in those communities. So now all of a sudden we were now educating the community on investments. We were educating their children on their first financial literacy types of projects. And it was, and this is a project being run by JMMB Bank out of Jamaica throughout the Caribbean. We completely shifted. Now it's mandated as part of the central bank in Trinidad and Tobago. 1% of all the deposits in the bank goes into this program that is now being rolled out throughout the country. So that's an example of where simple branding, marketing, looking at behaviors, we were able to actually shift something in the financial inclusion, literacy, all in one shot, right? But we had to tap into, it would have not have happened if we didn't tap into, as a private bank, they were looking for deposits, they were looking for branding in terms of their community engagement, so we had to keep our eyes on the indicators that mattered to the private sector to be able to get what we needed to get done.
Right, that's a part of big challenge, right? I mean, like you said, financial literacy and awareness has, I mean, there's a lot of awareness in financial literacy programs going on, but the intent hardly leads to action, right? There's a lot of gap, and I think that's a big challenge in financial inclusion. I mean, you go educate people, tell that this is useful for you. I mean, the bank will help you, give you a loan, and they think that it's free money. But people have this mental block towards actually going and conducting business with these organizations. Right? Any experiences that anyone has in trying to solve that intent action gap? Because that's a big problem that we're still dealing with in financial services.
So yeah, what we are working towards is on the micro savings challenge, right? So what we saw was, I mean, let's go back 3 or 4 years when the Jan Dhan accounts were opened, and almost every household, if not every person, had a bank account. And then what we realized after a year or so, that the accounts were lying dormant. And then there were a lot of studies to how to make them active, how do you encourage people to use bank accounts. And there were some initiatives from the government side, like, you know, your subsidies will go directly into the bank account, so there's some money into it, people are forced to use it in a way. And coincidentally, demonetization happened. And then, I mean, there was again like this whole forced to use your bank accounts, digital ways, somehow or the other. When we started this project about 1.5, 2 years back, we realized that, okay, people have bank accounts, they have even started using it. So it's not the case what was 4 years back, people are using bank accounts. But most of the times what you're seeing, and we knew this, it wasn't new that people, they get subsidies into the bank account, they withdraw the entire amount, and the bank, I mean, the account still remains dormant for almost the whole month. Another trend which we observed was people started depositing smaller amounts into their bank accounts. Why? Just because so that it doesn't get spent. I have 3,000 rupees, let me just go and deposit. And these are the cases where they had these banking correspondents right next door. So it wasn't a big pain for them to go to a branch. They would just go next door to the BC agent, doesn't cost them anything. He will just say, keep this 3,000 rupees. And then when we looked at the data, we spoke to them, and we realized that they would withdraw it pretty soon, like just like next week. So they started using their accounts for like transactional purposes, as like a temporary safe deposit box, not to keep at home. It will get spent, somebody knows I have the money, they will ask me, my uncle will ask me, my husband will ask me. And how the whole aim was to encourage savings, longer term savings, and reduce the reliance on loans. So these were the aspects which we saw, you know, how do we address them? Now there were, like we did some pilots, we did some prototyping, and we came up with design solutions, but working with, again, as Anurag said, making any changes in banking policies, in banking products, not just products, but into their core banking system to even do any kind of testing, I mean, is a challenge in itself. So that was one of the areas. Micro savings is still a puzzle. We are still working on it, working with organizations on, you know, how do we encourage these savings. And we are again working, it's like a assisted model where the banking person, the loan officer who goes to the doorstep, assists the customer in taking this decision about micro savings.
Zoom out a bit. So, you know, it occurs to me that if we zoom out enough, we realize that all of this behavioral insights stuff has got to be for something, right? I mean, which is to make impact, to make innovation happen faster, to bring innovation into an area of human decision making, namely the public sphere, which is slow, turgid, rule-bound, and poorly incented. So, you know, there's something very artificial that we're doing often, whether we're aware of it or not, which is bringing, I don't know, a bit of pizzazz and sex into the decisioning so that there can be some motivation for key decision makers to actually do things in a new way. We're giving them that license in some way by helping them believe and helping their superiors and other regulatory authorities believe that these deviations from the norm are well founded. And that founding and that grounding is going to begin with some amount of ethnographic insight and understanding about the people we're trying to serve and the ecosystem that we're trying to transform. So I want to say that I often find this confusion between things that are appropriate for the late stage of the intervention and innovation, i.e., evaluation and RCT trialing, confirming that the intervention was actually meaningful, and the early stage, which is to say, how do you know what we should be doing at all? And the answer to that will likely not be in the literature, nor in earlier RCT trials, nor in models that are easily replicable. So we got to have some kind of emergent model, which I'm happy to work with you guys on if you're interested in the coffee break afterwards, is something that works like early to late. When we do public sector innovations or public-private partnerships or any kind of CSR-driven aspirational districts interventions, whatever we do, there's got to be a stage, an early phase where we try to thematize what the problem is, some middle period where we try to decide what we're going to do about it, some attempt at it, and then we say, look, this is what we're learning from it.
Very quickly though, I think that idea of awareness, intent and action gap, right? I think for the longest time we have been defining our business as something that bridges that gap, right? Unfortunately, too much is spent on awareness and intent as if it doesn't exist, right? So whether you're talking about safe sex in Africa to prevent HIV, or you're talking about delinquency, right? I mean, delinquency in financial services is the safest case of when nobody intends to be delinquent, right? But yet 3-4% of the population is delinquent at any point in time, right? And so, my experience has been that where there is good intent, good awareness, which is the case in a lot of, public policy spaces also, like everybody wants to save, right? Everybody wants to lead a healthy life. I mean, nobody's saying I want to live a unhealthy life, right? I want to be financially indisciplined. I don't want to study, right? But the actions are not in line, and that's where I think behavioral science is very, very important. And there's a comment made some time back around the manipulative nature of behavioral science, right? And I think the overemphasis on behavioral economic principles can sometimes make it look manipulative in nature, right? But behavioral science is not just about applying a social proof principle or a confirmation bias or this, that, to kind of change people's behavior, right? A large part of it is understanding why people do what they do, and that's not a job of one particular, principle. That's about how you conduct research, how you take into account context, emotions, mental models in understanding behaviors, and then design products and services that are truly aligned to the goal of the user and the manufacturer, right? And there I don't see any manipulation, right? There is no manipulation. If a poor person wants to save, but because of whatever we know about scarcity and cognitive tunneling, is unable to do that, then when I kind of design products which allows them to save, despite that cognitive limitation of his, that's not manipulation. That's saying, I understand your goal. I also understand my design capability. I'm going to put this together to design something that works for you, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I did answer some of it and then I went somewhere else.
I think I would say, what Anurag said sums up it well, but I think it's important to understand that why is that intention action gap happening? We know there are biases. Everyone knows. I mean, let's not talk any more about biases. But I think behavioral science and the interventions go beyond biases. Is it a problem of choice that people are unable to make that choice? Has the choices been presented in a way that they are unable to make that choice? Is the infrastructure not available? And that's where I think the choice architecture comes in, where you need to look at an intention action gap, not just with the biases perspective, but really with the holistic perspective. Are these norms really religious norms, or what kind of norms are we talking about? Why are these norms there? So I think doing a thorough analysis, and that's where, which Sally Ann said, that marketing has been using behavioral science principles, which is a fact. But the difference between a behavioral science approach and a marketing approach to get people to do what you want to do or change behavior for good is this rigor and understanding of why are people not doing what they should normally do. Everyone should go to the gym, everyone should have good food or healthy food, but people are not doing that. So I think understanding those underlying factors and then addressing those factors rather than just looking at it as we want to get to the end result. So forget about the end result, work at the factors and you'll get at the end results.
Thank you, Yogita. Thank you, Anurag, for that. In interest of time, I would like to change tracks, and it's a question I think most audience would be interested in. As practitioners of behavioral science, how do you build behavioral science practice in your organization? And also, more precisely, how do you ensure that there's continuous learning and then you're not just stuck to like a laundry list of behavioral biases and heuristics?
Partnerships. Especially in a country like India where it is so nascent, there need to be collaborations and partnerships. You can't just be this siloed behavioral science kind of unit where you have some talent, but you need to collaborate, expand the network. We talked in the policy, Laura mentioned kind of secondments, internships. We need to build talent and capacity in that kind of way. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen there's a real need to fill.
I want to sort of touch on the point that Pavan made during his session, during his panel, wherein he talked about ethics. In the short span and few clients that I have been talking to, I think as practitioners, the onus of some of the ethics is also onto us, as well as the clients, of course, but really building this practice with a lot of ethical thought into it is important. So when you're building a behavioral science practice, and I don't know how best I can say this is how you build it, this is the model and go ahead and do it. I don't have an answer for that. But when you're doing, these are the factors to consider that have some kind of an ethical soundboard within your team, whether that it's an external soundboard, internal, to identify or to rather test before you actually get to that discussion mode of here are our interventions. Is this ethical to do? That's, I think, I would say.
So working with a seasoned organization like IDES 42, the advantage is that you do have some systems, processes, ways of working in place. So we do have a methodology within which we work. And then there are, of course, great experts around the world where we have this continuous learning approach. But I cannot agree more with everyone here that you need to have an exchange of learning locally. And in India, we see that experiments, there are far and few which are done like with full rigor, and we still see people quoting like 4 or 5 years back experiments, because not all experiments go through that whole rigor where they can generate enough evidence so that it can be applied, let's say, across sectors and shared with the world and across different situations. Can you contextualize it to other situations? So I think like there is a lot of scope. There needs to be more appetite for experiments, and where we can do with some rigor. I mean, with industry is fine. They don't have to be like socially driven, long drawn 5-year RCTs. But now with everything getting digital, these quick A/B testing tools are available. If we can have enough appetite amongst the donors, amongst the businesses, the industry participants, to just understand the value of testing experiments before taking things to scale, and also accepting the fact that failures are imminent. Not everything you design will succeed, and hence documenting, sharing these learnings is very important, because what's the point of doing something which has not worked somewhere else? You should learn from each other.
I can't tell you how to design because I don't think there are enough examples to kind of look at. But I can tell you how we did, right? And I think and I keep saying that to everybody I can get across in my own office, right? I think first up, this particular practice requires a lot of honesty, because it's so easy to impress anybody with the science, right? But I'm telling you, impact is an altogether different game, right? To create impact, very difficult. You want to impress a client, 5 minutes. You can say something intelligent about the brain, and the guy's like, wow, you're so intelligent. You just read it actually yesterday. That's not you developed it in your mind, right? So, honest, approach to the science will keep you ethically strong, but also, you will kind of focus on the impact piece rather than the impression piece, right? That's one. Two, to my mind, we'll have to look at teams different. Again, I kind of got into the preaching mode. Let me say what we did. So what we did was, we wanted to make sure that we don't get into this experimentative mindset, right? And we kind of think about the end experience of consumers, right? And the reason why, most of the team members in our office are still designers, right? So they come from backgrounds like architecture, industrial design, so on and so forth. And so you kind of, train them into behavioral sciences, right? So that makes sure that you're not kind of, just copy pasting some principle and, tweaking some words here and there and making it sound like a social proof happened just now, right? The third, I think, is, there is nobody teaching this science from an application point of view, right? There is just theoretical gathering that's happening. So you make your organization as not just a place where you practice the science, but also as a place that you teach the science, learn the science, right? So in Final Mile, for instance, I think the emphasis on learning, discussing, evolving is as important as practicing, right? So I think on an average about 40-50% of the timesheets are filled with people reading articles and reading books and so on and so forth. Hopefully one day we can stop that like every other practice does, because you get enough people with enough experience and you don't have to kind of spend 50% of your organization time doing this. And the final piece, as I said in the morning, right, you need to build engines on the science, right? So build your own process. I mean, ultimately we are designing, right? So the point you made around human-centered design or the behavior architecture process we kind of talk about is critical, because unlike advertising, for instance, where a client knows what he gets, he'll get a 30-second ad at the end of the process, right? Here you don't know what you might get, right? You don't know the solution definition, right? So there is ambiguity. What takes the ambiguity away is the process. So if your process is well codified, you know what will happen when, right? This is where research will happen. This is how research will happen. It kind of provides certainty in a space that is highly ambiguous, right? So those are the things that come top of the mind, but I'm sure there are many other things that went into making whatever we made thus far, but yeah, that's where I want to start.
Jafar, am I allowed to do a little bit of marketing? Because I know everyone is talking about not having courses, educational courses, but we are doing a one-day course in December, and then there are others planned. But if you guys are interested, you can go on our website and have a look at it, and feel free to enroll.
That'll be great. I mean, Junopi and I and Divyani have been trying to bring these people together, right? There's scattered interest all across the country, but people don't know. Like, to Preeti's point, we should share and publish the knowledge, right, about your experience, both good and bad. Yes, that's a great point. And also, not only in industry and policy, I mean, every person can be a behavioral scientist in the sense that they start applying behavioral science in their own personal lives, right? People hardly talk about that. We're always stuck to, how do we apply change behavior of the country, in the industry. So yeah, that's one thing to note. So it's 4:05. I think it'll be more fun when we start. Sorry, Preeti.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we do that to ourselves all the time. We try to, see how do we ensure to go to the gym. How do I stop myself from eating that cookie every day? Let's put some nudges in place. How do I stop my, maid to make bhindi every day? So things like those. We do that.
So I think, it'll be probably more fun now if we start taking questions and, to the panel. Yeah? Yeah. Mic, please,
How is social media helping to make behavioral change? One. what behavioral change worked in a country or which part of a globe which didn't work in another part of the globe?
Anyone wants to take it?
I'll just answer one part of that. Actually, I can answer both parts of it. So I think what social media and even industry has given us is analytics and data. That, you know, all of this conversation we're having, and when you kind of, I agree with you when you say everyone today is a behavioral scientist, data tells stories. And when you have large enough data sets, we're all looking to tell what story it's telling, particularly in the private sector. So social media things, you know, platforms, you know, those of us in the tech sector that know nothing about behavioral science, we can just look at our Mixpanel and Firebase, start looking at data and going, what does this mean? And what are our users telling us? And you then have to answer the question, I need to actually figure that out. So we're all tinkering in this space. So social media, I think, has accelerated completely. And not only social media, all the analytics platforms are giving all of us data that prior to that, maybe researchers only had access to from running experiments. Now we all have data and we're all running experiments and faster than the researchers. And we can A/B test on our own. And we don't even have to know anything about behavioral science, but if we look at the stories that the data is telling us, and with automation and machine learning, our users themselves are telling us and driving where we should be going on behavior. So I think it's accelerated the entire thing. The second thing I would say to you is in terms of where behavior has worked. So I'll talk about Cambridge Analytica in my country, Trinidad and Tobago. So actually, Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know if you saw the big report on Netflix, we were on there, 1.3 million people. And what was interesting was how, so where it worked and it didn't work, Cambridge Analytica was really interesting in that the thing that worked in Trinidad and Tobago would have not worked in how it worked in the United States. And let me tell you what they did and Trinidad is very similar to India in terms of ethnicity. And what they realized and how it worked there, but it wouldn't have worked in the US, was that if in fact parents they were able to nudge the parents to take the kids to vote, and that's what they played on. There was an entire no vote campaign to the African community because most of the parents in the African community are, you know, sadly are incarcerated, not heavily involved. So they marketed against the Indian parents that would get all their kids in the vehicle and take them to vote because that's the influence Indian parents have on their kids. I mean, we know that in India, if your parents tell you got to do something, you're doing it. That would have not worked. That type of behavioral nudge, which completely shifted the party that won, they should not have. And the swing votes came from the Indian community, and it came from a percentage of the population that never voted before. And it was tied to a specific campaign run by Cambridge Analytica to these Indian parents. That would have not worked in the US. So in the US, you know, already 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, you're not heavily influenced by your parents taking you to vote or what you're actually going to do. So that would be an example of where it would work and not work. Hopefully that helps, answers the question.
In terms of, sorry, I was going to say about social media. I mean, in terms of social media, how it sort of plays in bringing behavior change. I don't know if social media really helps bringing behavior change for good, but it does help the whole behavior contagion, a ripple effect of having people to express their preferences in open, giving them that open space, which is how, if you read Cass Sunstein's latest book, he talks about 4 things, how norms are changed. And social media helps somewhere to help those interactions, group polarization happens. So I think in that sense, the norms are changed over a period of time, but whether they change for good.
Can I make one quick, so I love structured data, but there's nothing like unstructured data, right? And figure emotions in it, right? You can figure goals and intent in it. And I think that capability is only going to improve dramatically over the next 1-2 years maybe, right? And part of the behavioral science is also to kind of make sure that the research is true, right? And it's not claim research where what people say is not what they mean, right? And I think the social media content can help that piece very, very dramatically in the very near future.
I'll just add something very quickly. At the risk of generalizing based on few experiments, at least in the fintech financial inclusion space, we saw, like, let's say SMSs have lost their importance, at least in India and Sri Lanka, another project which we did, while they worked well in Africa. So one could have been the literacy levels. People, understood what you're sending here. I mean, the language changes so much. People cannot read every time, and also you are just bombarded with so many junk SMSs that we all have stopped reading messages. So one generalized example.
Which sector SMS doesn't work, ma'am? Please, I just wanted to know that.
We experimented in financial inclusion. So
Because I work for the financial inclusion and we use SMS as our prime thing. I think it's
amazing. Great.
Yeah, not just in two different countries, it doesn't work
In
in
two different
places in the
contexts.
same room.
Yes.
Cool. Quickly take the next question.
So each of your organizations uses behavioral science to solve real world issues, but behavioral science is sort of interdisciplinary. I wanted to know what role economists or behavioral economists play in particular in each of your organizations.
Anurag, you want to take that?
We don't have a separation in that sense, right? So we bring together multidisciplinary teams on a project, and everybody works from the very beginning. There is no handover. So there is not like somebody is kind of framing the problem, somebody is doing the research, somebody is doing the design, right? It's a project team. They work right from the beginning to the end together. It's very collaborative. The idea of multidiscipline is to have them collaborate together and not just kind of create a handover, kind of an assembly system. So, the problem is that, everybody kind of tends to the median then. So a behavioral scientist comes in and then is working with design, so he's moving in a particular direction. And then, a designer starts moving to the behavioral science definition. And that's how we create behavior architects. And somebody mentioned that what is this behavior architect? It's nothing but probably everything put together into a way of thinking about human problems, right? So that's how we kind of make it work.
Is it working now? Oh, yeah. No, I have a question because I think a lot of what you've talked about was very much around product design, which I think is really interesting, and I agree with absolutely everything you've said. But I was wondering if, in your experience in the Indian market, have you seen interest from industry? And I'm a bit sad that there's no kind of like representative of large industries who've used behavioral science here, because there's a lot that can be done around working practices as well. And so a lot of the work we do with private sector is more around kind of like, women in the workplace, health and safety practices, stuff like this. Have you seen interest in India around this? Do you have examples of projects that you're doing with the Indian sector on this?
So yeah, we did a project for an Indian, it's a technology arm of an Indian conglomerate, and we did a DNI assessment. The challenge that we faced was again testing. They were not they didn't have the appetite or even the endurance to test the results. So what we ended up doing was a lot of analysis for them in terms of process analysis. So there were the targets which all organizations have. We have to have a certain number of women in the board. There are processes that they have of how hiring is going to happen. So we did recommend some of the process changes to them, but also a few interventions that they could try when the processes happen. Like, could we actually nudge the individual who's actually making a decision before he enters the interviews, have some kind of analysis that says, in the past you've had X number of interviews and the number of women hired through that is this much. So having some kind of a data ready with them and sharing some amount of data points with them, I think these are the suggestions we have made. Unfortunately, we didn't reach testing, but yes, there is interest in diversity and inclusion, um, to try something new, because globally we know that trainings are not working, and a lot of money is being used into unconscious bias training. So that's one area that we've seen.
I think in addition to, and I've noticed similar diversity and inclusion, I advised on a project a couple of years ago where it was a tech company who found that in one of their offices in India, there was a high burnout and high kind of stress amongst their engineers and their data scientists. And the management wanted to introduce flexible working policies, but they just didn't know what those would look like. Would they be kind of a 4-day working week, 1 day working from home, or just the freedom to work from home? And so we devised a kind of RCT over the course of 3 months, and very underpowered, very small scale, but it was a really kind of quick win in terms of just showing where the productivity kind of increased. And I think there is appetite for more kind of internal practices, and I know that kind of Google's like people analytics team really kind of started this off, and I think there is appetite, but it is a kind of gradual growth.
I'll talk about 2 projects very quickly in the APAC region. One is a hospitality chain that we worked on, and they came to us saying we only have 3 women in C-suite levels, and we would like to increase that to 20. And they were designing and developing a leadership academy. They wanted to know which women do we select, and what kind of behaviors drive women to C-suite levels. Within the region, we were not able to find another hospitality group with enough women for us to have clean data. To be able to, it's garbage in, garbage out. So what we did is we went to Latin America, and we were able to pull our data sets from Latin America, running our tool for about 6 months on women to find the behaviors that were the drivers in terms of getting women to C-suite levels. We came back. We were then able to run it on a large sample set of women in the region. We were able to then select which women, and we A/B tested in a really interesting way. We selected women in that who were already showing the behaviors that would get them to C-suite levels, and then we also ran another sample set of women who were very high on adaptability and behavior shift. And that was really, really an interesting project that had an outcome. So they ended up with, over 40 women who came out of that. They knew exactly what they were designing for and developing for in the Leadership Academy. So that was one. Another one we did in this region was a particular Middle Eastern country. They import 95% of their teachers. And they came to us and said, would you be able to tell us what kind of behaviors in teachers will give us outstanding versus good versus poor schools? They had a separate QA body outside of the government that was already creating a rating system for the school. We ran behavior benchmarks and situational judgment for a period of 6 months on 69,000 teachers. We came out with that data set, so we actually, no one operates in isolation. It's the combination in terms of teachers. And out of that teacher set, 93% were females that were being imported into this particular country. And now they actually know from a government level, as they bring in teachers every single year, not only how to put the teams of teachers together to produce the outcomes. Now, the outcomes does not mean their scorecard on what's outstanding, good, and poor. That's flawed in itself, but we're not going to get into that discussion. But based on the system that they had, we were able to go, well, we know this to be true. So that would be my 2 examples.
There are actually several, right? So if Unilever is large enough as a company, the first safety project we did in India was actually with Unilever, trying to kind of build safety culture amongst its employees, right? There's insurance companies that's come to us saying, how do we make salespeople more integral in their sales process and not kind of shortchanging consumers, right? We've kind of worked on stress projects, and how do you manage stress amongst journalists working for one of the leading publications, right? And that's what I meant by, the industry being very, very imaginative about, what we can do. We went to Unilever saying, we'll do shopper marketing programs for you, we'll do some product innovation program for you. But they're able to see where the science really kind of works. And I think one of my most successful programs with Unilever is the safety culture program, right? Rather than kind of selling more detergents and toothpaste for them, right? So merger acquisitions, culture management, these are all fairly popular amongst very large organizations in India.
So my question is again related to the question that was asked around the social media question. So now researchers have shown that because of the way social media has been and the platforms have been, the attention spans have significantly dropped, and the attention spans have now been actually gotten linked to the reduction in IQs as well. And the way these platforms exist, we see a lot of spread of fake news, extremism, and moral outrages happening on these social media platforms. Now, when I talk about these issues, what I get is that the user should get into a stage of digital detox, that you should spend less time on these platforms. Now, my first question would be that what do you think is the what percentage of responsibility do these creators have when it comes to designing a tech which is centered around just getting the higher amount of views and maximum engagement on these platforms? One. And second is, how do we begin to conceptualize or design social media in a manner where the function entirely isn't about getting views, but also designing it in a way that it leads to more engagement with the community and not just a platform where advertising happens in a better manner?
I'm jumping in only because I've been talking to a lot of social media organizations and a lot of product designers and all. I think in India there is hardly any conversation happening on this front. The government is concerned. Oh, sorry. I was saying that in India there is hardly any conversation happening on this front as compared to the West. In the US, they have the Detour Act, which was, I think, passed. I don't know if it's passed, but I did read that it was passed, which bans experimentation on users. So they cannot do RCTs. Companies like Facebooks and Googles and Ubers of the world cannot do RCTs to know what exactly the user is doing and how they behave. So that is being banned in the US. In terms of responsibility, of course, I hope that the makers have responsibility. Whether they themselves realize that, I don't know. I mean, if someone has a proper behavioral science unit which has some kind of a framework around it, I'm sure ethics will be part of it. But yeah, that's what I can say.
I was just going to say, I think the problem is often you design things with the best intentions, and Cambridge Analytica is a great example of it. Originated from the Psychometric Center in Cambridge, where they developed a personality tool, which was meant to collect personality data from Facebook for purely academic purposes. That then got, I mean, you've heard about it, you know what happened. So I think that's one of the issues that people often face, where they design these products not knowing how they can very quickly turn kind of negative and the dark side of that.
We did some work with one of the leading social media companies in the world to kind of understand how to manage. So we did some work with one of the leading social media companies in the world just to understand how to get the objectionable content managed on these platforms, right? So I think manufacturers are beginning to notice that it's not just about bad content, it's also about how people get disengaged when such content exists, or when you kind of make reports and object to such contents, and if the manufacturer doesn't take enough notice of it or take actions against it. But it's a crowdsourced platform, right? I mean, you and I are writing and you and I are consuming that data, right? So some of the work around there was to just see how the community can self-regulate and kind of, create the, much like gossip kind of a, punishment norm to make sure that, that kind of behavior is discouraged. And simply from, detoxing, I don't know if there is any way to do that. But if these guys are really smart, I think we should accurately understand them and use those principles in designing edtech products, maybe Fitbit products, and get people to do maybe the things that we really want them to do. But I don't think there is there's a colleague in my office who keeps saying that there is always a counter trend that starts the moment a particular trend kind of takes too much energy of its own, right? And so will that counter trend start? Has it started? You don't know. But some of these things do manage themselves, and a behavioral scientist need not necessarily go and intervene at this stage. That's just an escapist answer I'm giving you.
I just wanted to add real quick about responsibility. When you asked, is it the responsibility of who's actually putting, the content out there? I mean, if we start looking at that, is there any positive intention of cigarette manufacturers? Is there any positive intention of, I don't know, people who sell us donuts? So I think, we have to be really careful about that. There's always going to be things that exist around us that is just bad for us. And it's for us to be mindful of it. And we have that ability to shut it on or off. Clearly, social media is bombarding us. So that's what's taking our attention. But the reality is it really any different than whoever is, in terms of cigarettes? Hold on, why are you with your social media open?
Sorry, I mean, could I just jump in? I like the question a lot. I think it's really challenging and guilty as charged. So I gave up Twitter, cold turkey, about 6 months ago. I'm not on Facebook anymore, except to check what my neighborhood association does. And for sure, if you have products that you're disseminating that have adverse effects, there will be regulation. That's true of alcohol, that's true of all kinds of controlled substances, that's true of driving. Any number of sectors stand to be regulated, and I'm not sure this one doesn't. So there's a podcast, Should This Exist? Right, which takes this very question up, whether it's around AI or robotics or any number of other issues at the edge of ethics and science fiction. There are serious questions to be asked. So I want to say two things. One, from the perspective of a user, there's an article in the New York Times about dopamine fasting. So I think that's really killer idea. And as with most interesting things in this century, Gandhi was there first. So he had a Maun Vrat every once in 6 days at a time when he was being inundated with letters about enemas and sleeping with your wife without having sex, or any number of rando shit that he used to communicate with his public about. So he would take one day off to not, address the world. So I think that's a practical and meaningful approach. A tech Sabbath is something that, maybe all of us will be taking more seriously in the world. But the other part of the question, I think, suggests this issue of IRB for everything. And there's an article in the New York Times this weekend about IRB for yoga, right? So ways of signaling that you're open to being touched by your instructor on your genitals, by his genitals, or not, right? And if that kind of intimacy is not the kind of transcendental of the self you're interested in, then there should be ways for you to signal it with your badge or something, whatever. So I think this spreads out in the wider world, right? So there should be ethical filters on things that we do that have public effects. And I don't see this as something that is like a science research versus public services, public policy versus private sector thing, right? I mean, all kinds of private sector activities, when they begin to have adverse effects, will be controlled and regulated.
Sorry, just to jump in very quickly, it's just a little too fitting for me not to talk about. But I, a couple of years ago, co-founded a startup which focuses on eliminating digital distraction and helping people refocus in the age of digital distraction. But we're using technology to do that. And it is a contradiction, but we're trying our best to do this. And when it comes down to the ethics, and your question about designing with those ethics in mind, when we started, this is an app that kind of runs in the background of your phone or your desktop. And so technically we are getting a lot of very personal information and data. but we anonymize everything as soon as we get it. And so when we went into designing this app, we had those very clear principles in mind, and we are sticking to it. And we have met with, in terms of our enterprise version, we've met with organizations and kind of HR and operations who say, yeah, but this is not useful to us. We need to understand how this team is operating, and we're just not going to waver on that. So I think you do need to have, to your point as well, just principles when you go into it.
And I'm not laughing at your data. I have an app that uses AI and machine learning to
Yeah.
teach people to
We
be
all
more
do.
human.
We all do.
I think there's a question there.
Thank you for this discussion. As in, this was something that I was really looking forward to know about how behavioral science is coming into implementation. And my question to you is about, you talked about the need of and what kind of behavioral science teams would actually be required, or what kind of need is there in the companies as a team. But what kind of skills would you look for in a person who is in, say, operations or in different kinds of work in a particular organization, maybe a product or a service company? What kind of skills would be beneficial in those implementation organizations?
Sir, can I ask a clarifying question? You mean skills for the behavioral science team or skills for the
No, I mean, in general, like an operations team, what kind of behavioral science skills would be beneficial for such a, say, operations team?
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of organizations we worked with took up this whole behavioral design pretty well, and they really invested in building capacity in their organizations. So what we noticed there, what was working well is some kind of, you need to be open to these new concepts. Once you hear us, you need to go back, read about it, as a lot of people said here. I mean, we all are behavioral scientists in our own way. If you read a few, books, articles, you will see it happening in your daily lives. You'll be able to apply it to yourself every day. As a customer-facing organization, I think what's most important is the readiness to listen to your customer. To not just believe that I know what my customer trends are, I know what they want, I know what works for them, what doesn't work for them, but to go out again and again and see how they are interacting with your products, what could be the challenges with the person who is actually delivering it, so your staff, your last mile connectivity. So some kind of appetite to go back and seeing things on the ground, how well they are doing it, rather than just sitting and designing in your offices.
How do you actually integrate that into a team? Can anyone share an experience about that? Like, how do you inculcate such like listening culture within a team for better productivity?
In our case, it actually came from the top. So, if the top management has buy-in, we think the team listens, So you have the capacity building workshops, and then people adapt it, and when you're answerable to it. So, I mean, we kind of go with this principle: if the top management has a buy-in, and if the last person who's delivering your intervention has a buy-in, there are good chances you will succeed.
I just want to, so I don't know the skills, but I can say the competence. And in my experience, anyone who wants to, who's not say an economics graduate who's been teaching or learning economics for a long time and wants to start a career in behavioral science, because I've moved from a completely different career into doing my master's in behavioral science, I would say the competence would be have the curiosity to learn, the perseverance to know that not all behavioral science interventions are successful. You are going to have failures. Have the ability to connect the dots, because, for example, we did a proposal for a learning company wherein we wanted to do some interventions on attention bias. How do you keep learners engaged into whatever product they have? And we said, why do we focus only on attention bias in learners when we went for literature searches? And what we realize is attention bias exists in everything that you do, whether it's your health, whether it's your driving, whatever you're doing. So are there cases that are related to attention bias that we can use and apply into this intervention or this product or this problem? So I think having the ability to have a very broad view rather than a narrow view of, okay, this is for a cigarette company or whatever, let's look at cigarette. I think that from a competence point of view, I would say, I don't know if this is a skill, but yeah. So perseverance, curiosity, and the ability to connect and have a broader perspective.
If you're asking that, you want to make some behavior shifts in employees within the system who are kind of interacting with, say, consumers or delivering particular aspect of a service or a product, I kind of keep going back to the same thing, saying, you can keep expecting competencies to be there. The other way to look at it is, can I design a behavior shift, right? So we do so much of work with call center executives all the time, right? Trying to shift their behaviors, right? So for instance, right, going back to delinquency, when the chief risk officer came to me, he said, you know what, I don't know why my call center executives are so angry with delinquent consumers. I mean, I keep telling them that there's no reason for you to be angry, right? So treat them like my customers. You don't have to take moral high ground and so on and so forth, right? But again, if we have to kind of train them, rather than training them, we kind of create interventions that shifts their behaviors. The one thing I know is that these people, like salespeople, right, people who are dealing with consumers directly, they are very, very sensitive to effectiveness, right? Sometimes we who sit a little away from the consumers, right, we need to be told that something is successful. But an agent, right, if you kind of try and experiment with them, he can sense success very, very quickly. A salesperson can sense success very, very quickly. And then irrespective of whether the organization deploys the solutions or not, that solution is already deployed because the salesperson doesn't care. He thinks, oh, this works, I'm going to use it, right? That's the kind of experience we have had with salespeople and call centers, and hopefully in the future with other operational kind of employees. I hope it kind of answered.
Sorry, on a lighter note, if you're not used to reading research papers, and if you want to learn behavioral science and you've never done economics research, make sure you start reading. Because when I did my master's, the first paper that was sent as a pre-read was a 64-page paper.
Excuse me, yeah.
Just one more question, yeah.
Salian mentioned about ad industries. She was mentioning about the ad industries doing something very similar for decades and decades together. So my question, particularly to the panel as well as to Laura here, is what is the difference to what ad industries have been doing? One might argue successfully for so many years, to that of what behavioral economics is trying to do, except for the fact that there is a lot of data science involved and there is a scientific framework of going about it in terms of the impact. A, and B, how do organizations, behavioral consultancies work differently to organizations like Ogilvy Change, which made a great impact in UK with some of the campaigns, which were also having partly their ad culture mixed with the behavioral culture. So these are the two parts of the question that I wanted to ask the panel as well as to Laura.
Let's have Laura go first.
Partly because I'll admit I was on Twitter, which is terrible. And someone said your name. I feel really sorry. What's the question? You have to forgive me, I landed at 4 a.m.
No issues, we are all used to that. Yeah. So my question was, Salian was mentioning about ad industries, getting into consumer insights really well over so many years. So how are we different? How is the behavioral economics consultancies now different? And in terms of impact, and also in terms of how they go about bringing change.
Okay, so you mean how do we distinguish ourselves from the fact that this is actually stuff that people have been doing for a very long time? I mean, in terms of tools, we don't really, except for I absolutely agree with the idea that it's about like kind of bringing the rigor of science into, kind of tools that have been intuitively used by many for many years. And so it's about, you know, kind of like learning from the best. So we do learn from like the best marketing campaigns, the best advertising campaigns have actually understood how to talk to people. But those are all tools, right? I guess what distinguishes us, and this is, I think, something that would be shared by everyone here, is really the mission we give ourselves, right? It's like a tool is a tool. I always use this metaphor because it works well, but you know, a hammer is a hammer. And I can decide to build a house, or I can decide to bash someone's head in. It's all about the kind of ethical. Sorry, I thought you might appreciate the violence of my speech. No, but the ethical framework I put around it, the mission statement I give myself and I give my organization is what's going to determine what I do with the hammer. And by the way, it's also something that needs to be revisited all the time, and where you need that critical friend, that critical soundboard. We need to face each other, and I need to sit in a room with Ideas 42 who's going to look at me and be like, that thing you did was kind of shit. But that's important. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to give credit to Ideas 42's incredible publishing initiatives. I think there aren't very many organizations who spend so much of their resources publishing their work, making sure they organize what everyone else has been learning in the field, and so big props to them. So I think this is kind of it. I don't know if that answers your question. Ish.
In terms of the impact, I was looking at how much difference does it make in terms of impact. I'm in line with you regarding the ethical framework of it. But aren't we getting to, you know, scientific centric, in trying to have a lot of data analytics going around it and the big data going around it, although impact-wise, maybe there is not a substantive difference.
Well, I don't know, because without the data, you can't tell me how much impact these guys had. No, I see what you're saying. Yes, perhaps. And it's a choice, and I think it goes to what Nate was saying in the morning as well. It's a choice that you have to make. Sometimes there are circumstances where you think that there's something really important to be learned, or there's a very, very strong promise of impact, but you can't use the scientific methods that we'd like to use for rigorous evaluation. And so you try and you do your best. And so this is what we do a lot with government. For us, it's about saying, you know, we're always going to try and attempt to evaluate as well as we can. We're going to try and learn. If that means using other methods than, you know, a rigorous large-scale RCT, we do that because we're in the business of trying to learn and gain insights. So in that sense, you know, people have been doing consumer insights, market research firms. They've been doing similar things. They've been learning around similar things. And I think, you know, again, these are tools that we respect. I mean, we work with people who do, like, you know, social media listening campaigns, or where you try and learn, like, consumer insights. We collaborate with people who do focus groups. You know, we try and learn from their methods to see what there is to learn from each other. In terms of the scale of impact, we're comparing apples and oranges somewhere. So yes, probably marketing has been much more successful than we have overall, but.
Cool. Thank you, Laura. So we're well past the time, so I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much to the panel for sharing their experiences. The discussion doesn't end here. I think most of us are around for some networking outside right after the event. And I'll pass, sorry.
I just wanted to say one thing on behalf of all of us, really quickly. So the founder of this organization is Divyani, who's sitting in the back of the room. And I have to say this, thanking her, because we've been working together for the last 5 years since she was a student. And last year, she came to me and said, I would like to do something that would last beyond my lifetime. And she created this group. So I want to thank her on behalf of all of us for this lovely event.
Thank you, Sally Ann, for those kind words. So we'll wrap up this session, and Pankti would just speak for a bit, conclude the session, and then I can disperse and network outside. Yeah.
With you.
Okay, go ahead, yeah.
So firstly, thank you so much for coming here and making this such a great event. Like Sally Ann said, it would not have been so great and so spectacular if not for any of you here. I'm going to quickly say thanks to our sponsors who've been amazing with all the support and all the help that they've given us for who we are today and what we've done here. And thanks again to all the volunteers today, especially Sushanti, Sukanya, Torsha, Vedika. Nikhil, Ayushi, Khushbu, and Sayantan, who helped us immensely with all the technical glitches. Apologies for that. That was a really bad time in the policy session, but we made it past somehow. And last but not the least, yes, of course, the organizers and the co-organizers. You've already thanked Devyani, but Jafar and Junafi, and we've flown from Switzerland and London to be here and be part of this amazing session. So thank you for all the sleepless nights we've had and the stressful days we've had to make sure this goes really well. I'm really, really glad this came through so well. I was going to kind of summarize the day, but I feel like we're all really exhausted for that, so I'm not going to do it. I hope you all remember what we spoke throughout the day. So lastly, just for the peak end effect, we've got tea and coffee outside on another round, just so everyone's in a high energy mode when leaving. And yes, one more thing. We would like to take a picture with all the speakers and moderators as organizers of the event as a memorable photograph. So if you could just stick around for 5 minutes and we can take arrange a picture. And that's about it. Thank you so much, guys, for making this epic. And we shall do this again next year in Mumbai. So watch out and reach out for any support, any help that you'd like to give us, and we'd make it double grand. Yeah, that's about it. Jafar?
Yeah, just a few more things. A big thanks to all our sponsors for making this happen and all the encouragement that we've had. Final Mile, Bias, Nudgin, JPAL, Ashoka, CSBC, and Buzara. Thank you all so much for this appreciation, right? And we'll hopefully do this again soon. Yeah, cool.
Can we have a big round of applause for everyone and everything?
Great.
Hey there, you based in Delhi?
I'm based in Mumbai.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have a card or something?
I do not, but do you have...
Just tell me your last name.
I've got a long last name, but sorry,